families that lived there had been living there for generations. So, back in 1999, Jessica Dishon's family lived there. So, Jessica Dishon was born on May 2nd, 1982, to Michael and Edna Dishon. Jessica had two little brothers named Michael Jr. and Christopher. 17-year-old Jessica was a senior in high school at Bullitt Central. Jessica had been involved in the ROTC, which stands for the Reserved Officers Training School. She had also been part of the color guard in high school her freshman and sophomore years. But Jessica had quit the color guard when she was old enough to get a job because she really wanted to be able to buy a car. So she gets a job at Hardee's and saves up her money so she can buy a car. She had aspirations of attending culinary school. She loved to cook. She was always cooking for her family and experimenting with food. Jessica was a good student. She got good grades. Her manager at work talked about how reliable she was and what a hard worker she was. Friends and family members of Jessica say she was just a really trustworthy girl. She was very dependable. So Jessica was really just like any normal teenage girl. She was obsessed with butterflies, and when she did save up enough money, she bought herself a red Pontiac, and she always had plans to kind of leave the small town she was raised in and go out and adventure on her own when she was old enough after she had graduated from high school. On September 10th, 1999, it was just kind of another normal morning for the Dishon family. The family wakes up and just goes about their normal routine. Jessica's mother, Edna, woke up at 5:30 to get ready for work. Her husband, Mike, walked her out to her car that morning and kissed her goodbye like he did every morning. And then he went back inside to wake up Jessica's little brothers. Mike peeked in on Jessica, and she was still asleep in bed. Then Mike went out and climbed into his truck and sees her daughter's purse, her cell phone, and one shoe. Mike, fearing that something bad was going on, rushes home as soon as his wife discovers there's like one shoe on the floor of the driver's side. Just one. So they feel like this with the fact that everything was still in her car. She didn't take her cell phone. She hadn't left on her own. Like, they just knew that from the scene. So they pick up Jessica's phone to look at it, and they see that Jessica has dialed the numbers 9 and 1, as if she was trying to call 911, but was interrupted. Her mother just knows that this cell phone is proof that Jessica is in trouble. Obviously, her daughter was trying to call 911, but was interrupted. And Edna said, like, the wind was knocked out of her when she picked up her phone and saw that. Edna called Jessica's school, hoping maybe she did end up at school, but Edna was told that Jessica never made it in that day. Upon hearing this, Jessica's parents rushed to the sheriff's department, but the police felt like Jessica was probably just a runaway. Her father insisted that if she had run away, she would have taken her cell phone, her car, her wallet, both of her shoes. But the officers insisted that the Dishons just go home, and they tell them to come back the next morning if Jessica doesn't show up by then. The family was devastated that the police just didn't seem to have any interest in helping them locate their daughter. Edna said, quote, "Our daughter is missing and no one wants to help," end quote. Lynn Hunt, a cold case detective, would later say that the minute Jessica had been reported missing, the state police should have been called in right away, but they weren't. So first thing the next morning, Edna and Mike Dishon And the same night that the family had searched for Jessica, her brother came in the house and he said he had been out taking the dogs out and he thought he heard Jessica screaming help. And as soon as Jessica's father, Mike, heard this, he ran in his room and grabbed his gun and took off out the door. And as he's running out the door, his brother Stanley is pulling up and he's like, "What's going on? What's happening?" And he said, Christopher thought he heard Jessica. So the two brothers take off searching the surrounding property, but there are no signs of Jessica. Now, up on the hill, there is an adjacent property that has a hill on it. And up on a hill, they noticed this small fire. So, this property is owned by the Brooks family, and they approach the fire to find a man named Bucky Brooks, who is their neighbor, burning some clothing. So the Dishon family and the Brooks family had lived next to each other for years, and at the time Jessica went missing, there was a lot of tension in that relationship. So Michael Dishon was very suspicious of his neighbor. When he finds him burning clothes, he is like, "Can I search your property? We're looking for my daughter." But they would not grant permission for the Dishon family to search their property. And this made Mike Dishon even more suspicious that maybe Bucky Brooks was involved in his daughter's disappearance. So, the Dishon family calls the police department to report the suspicious behavior. Really, he just didn't feel like it was a normal thing to burn clothes. You throw away clothes, you donate clothes, you don't burn clothes. So Mike Dishon goes to the police department and says, "Look, my neighbor's burning clothes. I feel like that's very suspicious." And suddenly the police department becomes very interested in what Jessica was wearing on the day she disappeared. So the family tells them that she was wearing a pink pair of shorts and just a white top. And the police end up getting a search warrant to search the Brooks farm and their property, the home, the garage, everything. According to the county sheriff, while the search was being done, Bucky Brooks was acting very strangely. Law enforcement had brought in cadaver dogs to help with the search, and they said that the dogs alerted to the presence of human remains at Bucky Brooks's fire pit, where he had been burning clothes. Inside the fire pit, they found 2 pairs of jersey gloves, and the cadaver dogs hit on these gloves. When Jessica's family learned that the dogs had hit at Bucky Brooks's house, they felt certain that police would make an arrest. But an arrest wasn't made. At this point, the Dishon family felt like the said that the only way the FBI will get involved is if, like, local police ask for their assistance, or if the family does. So the FBI arrived soon and began investigating Jessica's case. They searched the Dishon home, paying close attention to Jessica's bedroom. They took several items into evidence and tested for fingerprints. Jessica's car was also impounded. Helicopters were brought in for an aerial search. Agents searched the area surrounding the Dishon home, but they searched the landscapes as well. They searched ponds. They searched everything. The FBI also secured a warrant to search the Brooks farm. Inside the barn on the Brooks property, FBI agents discovered a photo of Jessica Dishon. And at this point, it became very difficult for the investigators to dismiss Buggy Brooks as a suspect. In fact, he was the only suspect. He was their prime suspect. The problem was nobody knew where Jessica was. On September 27th, 1999, 17 days after Jessica had gone missing, a family friend named Karen Hobbs was driving through the river bottoms, and as she was driving, she just kind of glanced over and she saw something like propped up on a tree, and she stops her car and calls the police because to her it looks like a body. The FBI forensic team was dispatched to the scene to find a decomposed body that was almost unrecognizable. Part of the limb was gone, some of the fingers were missing, and the body did appear to be that of Jessica Dishon. Law enforcement were sent to the Dishon home to notify them that they were pretty sure they had found Jessica's remains. The family was heartbroken, but they were also extremely angry because police had told the family that they thought Jessica was a runaway, and had they started searching for her sooner, they may have been able to find her alive and bring her home. Michael Dishon chose not to go to the scene. He knew he would not be able to handle seeing his daughter's body like that. Jessica's mother, Edna, however, rushed to the scene, where she fell down on the ground next to her daughter's body. She would later say she couldn't even tell if it was Jessica from her face because it was so badly decomposed. And a part of her hoped that maybe everyone was wrong. Maybe this wasn't Jessica. But then she noticed the butterfly tattoo on Jessica's side, and she knew police were not mistaken. This was her daughter. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Jessica's jaw had been broken, and some of her fingers had been removed. But one of the most haunting pieces of information that the ME released was that Jessica had been kept alive gone through for 3 days, and that was almost more than they could bear. This further ignited their anger toward the sheriff's office. Paul Parley, the former sheriff in Bullitt County, would later say that they had a very small police department. They had just 2 detectives who worked on the Jessica Dishon case day and night, trying to find the girl. After Jessica's remains were discovered, the FBI interviewed Bucky Brooks. He was caught lying several times in his interview, and he even told investigators that he had seen Jessica walking down the road the morning she had gone missing. When the FBI followed up on this statement, he said there was no way he could have seen Jessica because he was in bed having sex with his wife that morning, and his wife corroborated the story. But basically everything Bucky said to police, he would turn around and get caught in a lie, so everything seemed pretty inaccurate. The FBI gave Bucky Brooks a polygraph exam, which he failed. The FBI then handed over all the information that they had gathered over the course of their investigation to prosecutors, and a grand jury indictment was brought against Bucky Brooks. So Bucky Brooks goes to trial on murder charges, and he was facing the death penalty. The first day of the trial, the Dishon family felt very confident that Bucky Brooks would be found guilty. The trial seemed to be going very well for the prosecution, and while the defense tried to just show how badly the case had been handled, prosecution seemed to have the upper hand early on. They even brought in another possible suspect who they tried to pin the murder on. This was a local drug dealer who had a very bad reputation. He had several run-ins with the law over the years, and this witness tells the court that he saw Jessica on the day she disappeared around 4 p.m. So he even admits under oath he was Jessica's drug dealer. Then the defense puts a detective on the stand who had worked the case, and they really just kind of start hounding this guy. In a moment of frustration, this detective says that Bucky Brooks had failed his polygraph test. Now, as we know, polygraphs are admissible in court, and because of this slip-up, the judge ordered a mistrial, and the trial just stopped. The Dishon family was absolutely devastated, and they just felt like nothing was ever going to happen. They were never going to get justice. So a mistrial doesn't mean that the defendant is not guilty. And at this point, it's up to the prosecutors to bring new charges against Bucky Brooks. But they don't, and the Jessica Dishon case just kind of grinds to a unsolved cold cases. Lynn Hunt, a cold case detective, was brought in, and her first case was the Jessica Dishon case. As Lynn began looking into the investigation, she was kind of shocked by how little information the sheriff's office had. There was no contact information for people that they had interviewed over the years. No addresses, no phone numbers, no birthdays. Basically, there was nothing. So, Lynn goes to speak to the Dishon family, and basically she just wanted to let them know that she would be reopening Jessica's case. So then the Dishon family shows her Jessica's bedroom, which has still been untouched since the day she left. So they walk into the bedroom, and Michael goes into Jessica's closet and takes out this hat box and hands it to the investigator. And inside was Jessica's shoe, the one that had been left in her car, her cell phone, her wallet, basically all of the evidence that had been left in the car that police had never collected. So this evidence was taken straight to the police department, and 13 years after Jessica's murder, it was finally entered into evidence. Now, when Bucky Brooks had been on trial, his lawyers had hired a PI to help investigate, and so Lynn went to the defense attorney's office and asked if she could have the information from the Bucky Brooks trial. And it was like boxes and boxes, way more than the police department had, and she brought everything that the defense team had, and she just began pouring through the information. As she's going over all the information, she finds something very interesting, and it's a pretty big break in the Bucky Brooks case. Bucky had undergone a mental evaluation prior to his trial, and in this evaluation it stated that Bucky Brooks had an IQ of 61. And what this means is that he never, ever should have been given a polygraph, because someone with such a low IQ, they don't understand the questions, and they don't understand the way they're answering the questions. At this point, this investigator doesn't know if Bucky Brooks committed the murder, but she does have a explanation for why he failed his polygraph so miserably. Either way, she knows she has to solve this case. Now, remember, the defense team had tried to make this drug dealer look like the fall guy, like he had been involved. And there was actually quite a bit of circumstantial information that made it look like he may have been involved. But no one had followed up on this after the trial. So when Lynn realizes that police never even looked into him as a suspect, she tracks him down, and this is easy because he is incarcerated. But his alibi was that he had been at a hotel with his girlfriend day, on the day that Jessica went missing, and Lynn is worried that she won't be able to verify this because it was like 13 years ago. Hotels do not keep records that long, but she ends up finding a janitor who had to go in and do some work on the room that this drug dealer was staying in. And when the drug dealer got brought up in trial, he remembered, oh my gosh, I was in their room. And so he was actually able to give this drug dealer an alibi 13 years later. So while Lynn is making progress, she's still kind of back at square one because there was not a single piece of evidence that pointed to any possible suspects. Then Lynn gets a call from another detective who says he has some information regarding the Dishon case. This detective had a prison informant who claimed that he knew who killed Jessica Dishon. According to Lynn, jailhouse informants are shaky at best, and she was very hesitant to believe anything that any informant was saying. But this informant was interviewed, and he said that he had been in the same jail cell as the man who murdered Jessica Dishon. This murderer had been in jail for sexually abusing children, and the two ended up in the same cell. So this informant goes on to tell police that this man claimed that he kept Jessica alive for a couple of days and then strangled her. He also had information about the mutilation of Jessica's remains. He claims the reason that Jessica's remains had been mutilated was because the man who did commit the murder wanted it to look like drug dealers had done it. So, this informant is telling detectives information about Jessica's case that were never released to the public. Basically, the information this informant had to have come from someone who was there when Jessica Dishon was murdered. He goes on to tell police that Jessica was kept in a barn and tortured. The barn was described as being near where teenagers partied, and he also said that some of Jessica's belongings are buried underneath a tree that had fallen down. So when police ask who this inmate was who confessed to the murder, the informant says the murderer is Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle. Stanley Dishon was Michael Dishon's brother, and he was the one who became so violently ill when the family was searching for Jessica that he had to be taken home. Investigators would later realize that when Stanley started throwing up, the family was within a mile of where he had placed Jessica's remains, and he was kind of turning the family's attention to him so they would stop searching in that direction. So investigators go down to the river bottoms and they begin digging, and they dig and they dig, but they find nothing, and it's pouring rain. They're digging for like 7 hours, and they just give up. And as they're driving away, someone points out a spot where the local teens start looking, and the ground is just dirt. And she sees something like some kind of material sticking out of the dirt. And it's fabric, and there's like a bunch of junk piled on top, but this fabric really interests the detective. So she begins to like pull it and pull it, and soon she's holding a sheet that is identical to the comforter on Jessica Dishon's bed. So they leave the building with this sheet in tow, and they rush to the Dishon home. Investigators wanted to look in Jessica's bedroom because her bedroom still hadn't been touched. No one had done anything to her bedroom. So they go to the home and they explain that they need to look in Jessica's bedroom. So they lead detectives into Jessica's room, and she walks in and she pulls back the comforter. And guess what's missing? Jessica's sheet. They're just looking at a mattress. But because no one had ever touched Jessica's room, no one ever realized that sheet was missing. So detectives were able to determine that Stanley Dishon had been sexually abusing his niece for years. The morning that she disappeared, Stanley had shown up at Jessica's house. He was part of the family. He knew the routine, and he knew when Jessica would be alone. So he waited for the family to leave, and then he shows up. But Jessica had recently been dating a boy from school, and she threatened Stanley. She said, "If you don't leave me alone, I'm gonna tell my boyfriend everything you've been doing to me since I was a little girl." And Stanley knew if his brother found out about the abuse, he would kill him. So he knocked Jessica out. He punched her, and this was where her jaw broke. And then he took her to a barn where he kept her and tortured her for 3 days before strangling her. When Michael Dishon was told that his brother was being arrested for Jessica's murder, he said, quote, "If he'd done it, I want the death penalty," end quote. So throughout the Jessica Dishon murder investigation, law enforcement ended up finding several victims that Stanley had been sexually abusing. One of the victims said Stanley began abusing her when she was 6 years old. So he was not only facing murder charges, he was being charged with kidnapping and multiple counts of rape from several different victims. The prosecutor, however, knew how difficult it would be for these victims to have to get up in court and testify against their abuser. So they ended up offering a plea deal to Stanley so that the victims weren't re-victimized in the process of the trial. Stanley Dishon ended up pleading guilty to 4 counts of rape in addition to manslaughter for Jessica's death, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. After years of not knowing what had happened to their daughter, the Dishon family finally got the closure they needed, and while having Jessica's killer behind bars does give them some sense of justice, the information found during the investigation will likely haunt them forever. While detectives were going through old case this information from Bucky Brooks's defense team. They find a note from another prison informant, and this one was from 2002. This letter said, in part, quote, "I am an inmate and I was in a cell with Stanley Dishon when he admitted to me that he killed his niece and dumped the body in the river bottoms. So please check into this matter." This information had been kept in a box, and no one had followed up on it. Stanley just lived his life, like freely. He just went about his life after killing his niece, still free to sexually abuse other children, and the evidence had been given to the prosecutors and the sheriff's office, but they did nothing. Detective Lynn Hunt would later say, quote, "The shocking thing about the case isn't that Stanley Dishon murdered his niece. The shocking thing about this case was that they knew about it back in 2002 when they had Bucky Brooks on trial, and they did nothing about it." End quote. Edna Dishon said that while Stanley is sitting in prison, that doesn't feel like justice to her. The family had really hoped he would receive the death penalty. Stanley will be 77 years old when he is eligible for parole. This case is infuriating to me because I think sometimes law enforcement lock in on someone who they think is the suspect, and they don't look at other evidence, and this is obviously what happened in this case because they had a letter saying Stanley Dishon had said he murdered his niece, but they already had someone else on trial, and that might make them look bad or whatever, so they just continued. Anyway, Bucky Brooks could have spent the rest of his life or even been put to death for a murder he didn't commit. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you next time.